the scene a little bit and kick things off
Can we
here?
just record this?
Oh, interesting. I didn't notice that the Craig bot left.
It just
Now
left.
recording.
Okay, nice. Canadian Bennett's probably all over it. Yeah, it looks like. Sweet. Cool. All right, so was just gonna say that, and I had to step out for 10 minutes or so, so I missed a little bit of the last call, but I feel like, you know, to the extent folks want to continue discussing the why of what we're building, I feel like that's also appropriate, but figured that it would be helpful to talk a little bit more about the what as a group, and just some notes I have that of things I would like to get through would be discussing more tactically what's left to ship wells, what's left to ship tractor, of which there's a lot, what's left to get the Sunrise BIP out, and what's left in Silo v3, what's getting worked on there at the moment with regards to Pizza Man's work, the remove withdrawal timer stuff, and then hopefully also a little bit about what's left to get the UI up to speed with the protocol. So curious if folks have other things that they want to get out of this call or hope to achieve. Perhaps Publius, Chad, Red Beans, anyone else? Any other thoughts there on what we should be trying to cover here?
Yeah, I'll say one thing which maybe is best discussed a bit separately, but happy to get into all of those topics. But I also personally feel that some discussion around narrowing focus, at least in the short term, is probably something that would be helpful. So not sure if now's the time to do that, but happy to just talk through my understanding of all of the above, a lot of which I'm working on actively. In the case of trackers, just talk a little bit about kind of what it's going to take from my perspective. But yeah, if you feel like that's the most helpful thing here, let's do it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess on that front, as things come up, feel free to, given this call is about the what, I feel like it would be very appropriate to talk about whether something being worked on is worth doing. All right, so if nothing else, figure we can start with wells, and also at some point, for the
maybe just to hop in, maybe
Sure.
it would be helpful to bifurcate the discussion first, going through what is being worked on, the stuff that you raised, Guy, and try to figure out what is remaining to get it over the finish line, and maybe even a little bit of what the utility we expect to come from a given thing is. And then after that, if there's time or another time after, in the next couple of days, if we can't get through all of it, then we should have a conversation about what should be the focus and how to prioritize, but want to make sure that we separate a little bit what is currently being worked on and its status from how to optimize going forward. And it's hard to have the optimization question without first being aligned on where we're at.
That sounds fine.
Fair
Fine
enough.
with me.
Would agree there. Cool. And
Cool.
At different points, would probably like to hopefully call on a couple different devs that are here to speak up. So just let me know if you're not game, or shoot me a DM or something like that, and I'll ask someone else. So on the wells front, wanted to talk through the various different parts of the stack with regards to contract development, middleware, the UI, etc. So first, and also in the context of like audit timelines and things like that, I think that it'd be helpful, Publius, for you to briefly share in the context of wells, or maybe like I guess maybe it's best to refer it as the greater wells DEX architecture. What code is currently not in the hands of auditors? I know it's at least pumps and a couple other things, and when are you or what's the current timeline or hope with regard to getting those over to Halborn and potentially Cyphrin.
Sure. So there are kind of 5 or 6 different components in the wells right now. There's the core well code, there's the well function, there's the pump, there's the aquifer, and there's the auger. So I guess that's kind of 5 parts. The first implementation of a well, the constant product well function, and the corresponding auger for the first implementation of a well are currently in the hands of Halborn. The 2 pieces of code which are not are the pump and the aquifer. The aquifer is the contract that's going to be called to deploy a well, and it serves as a sort of well registry that can kind of confirm whether or not it deployed a given well, and because of that, also provide proof of the pump, the auger, and well function that were deployed with the well. So that piece of code, there needs a little bit of discussion on development side to really iron out the details of what should this registry be, but believe that the code is pretty not too complicated, and only really the extraneous details need to be figured out. The reason why it's not in the hands of Halborn is largely just because it wasn't ready or fully specified when the audit started, and now since has been for the most part. So, kind of I think the plan has been to do kind of 2 stages to it, and then the pump and the aquifer will be handed to Halborn when they're both ready. On the pump side, it's a quite it contains a lot of complex mathematics that require, more significant detail testing and, more reasoning. So on the pump side, one thing that would be, I guess it might be helpful to walk through kind of the pump and how it works. So going to put in the Barnyard chat here, a markdown specifying how the pump works. And then, it would be helpful to kind of walk through it, and, would welcome anyone and everyone to try to challenge, the logic in this pump to see if there's a potential way that some sort of manipulation could occur on chain. But for the most part, kind of there are 3 things that's tracked by the pump, and each kind of serves a different function. The first is a multi-block MEV resistant last balances number, which is a some tracking of the balance in the pool at the time it was last updated with some manipulation protection. The manipulation protection is a maximum % change in the value per block. So it could specify that the balance in the pool can't change by more than 50% in a block or 80% in a block. And what this does is provide a first kind of layer of protection against significant changes in balances. This is something that is possible due to multi-block MEV, where a given entity could, through random occurrence, be the proposer of multiple consecutive blocks, and thus be able to set the balances at the end of the first block equal to anything that's feasible or possible on chain for them in a risk-free way, given that they have full control over the next block and can guarantee that no other on-chain actor could perform a transaction before they're able to put the balances back to what they were, whether that be a remove liquidity event or something. So say, there's a Bean-ETH pool, some actor could, in the first block, add a bunch of ETH to the pool. Now, assuming, in some cases, especially with wells, it might be a zero fee pool, which means that there is a zero cost to them performing this addition to the pool. And therefore, by adding something like maybe $1 billion worth of ETH to a Bean-ETH pool, they could set that delta B to be, probably something in the high hundreds of millions, depending on how much liquidity is in that pool. In the next block, again, they are proposing 2 consecutive blocks. So ultimately, they are the ones ordering the transactions in the block and determining what transactions are in the block. In the next block, they could remove that liquidity as the first transaction of the block. Again, if this is a zero fee pool, there's a zero cost to doing so. And from an Oracle perspective, now most oracles, take some sort of aggregate over some time period. And kind of the problem here is, no matter how long you might be aggregating over, one data point that changes a balance by something like 100,000% or more, is still quite significant even when averaged out over a time frame. So it's like in the case of the minting schedule, it calculates a balance over 3,600 seconds. So for 12 of those seconds, which is the length of a block, if the balance is up, kind of 10,000%, one can do some math, and I guess let's say 100,000%. 100,000% increases, and I don't know, just doing some mental math, some math real quick, but about something like, would imagine 300% on the whole. So something by having some, cap on the per block change goes a long way in kind of preventing this, as, say it's restricted to, a 90% change. At most during one block, the most the balance could increase is 90%. Now, the ramifications are, in the case where something like this actually happens naturally, the Oracle will lag a bit more behind. So what this parameter should be and set to is, it should be considered significantly. However, it's very infrequently the case such that in a mature market, that the corresponding liquidity values of any 2 tokens would change so quickly and so significantly in the course of a single block. The way it behaves over multi-block is that it exponentiates the factor by which it's allowed to increase and decrease. And so that kind of is the first thing the pump does, is provide this kind of single block raw balance percent manipulation. And the next 2 things it does are track a geometric EMA of the balance in the pool over some variable time horizon that can be set, and a cumulative geometric SMA of the balance over time. So why, I guess the first thing to note here is, that both of these are geometric values. So the reason geometric means were chosen here is, largely inspired by the kind of the Uniswap v3 Oracle and the fact that it uses geometric means. Geometric means, seem to have, kind of less general deviation in relation to outliers, which acts as, which also helps prevent against short-term manipulation. It's kind of hard to kind of showcase the difference without a graph, but think going to try to generate some graphs that can be shared with the DAO to really showcase the difference between how a geometric mean and an arithmetic mean react to significant short-term deviations or outliers in the actual value. When dealing with values that are quite significantly high, something in the orders of magnitude such as tokens, when including the amount of decimals they have, they behave very similarly. And so thus it's like the implications, so they both track the average quite similarly. Another thing to note is what's great about geometric, kind of math is that because it's all like multiplicative, it can be converted into like its log value and used with standard arithmetic math. If you take the log of a times b, the log of a times b equals the log of a plus the log of b. By converting values into their base logarithmic values, it drastically reduces the need for precision, which allows kind of values to be compacted on chain quite well, and allows for simple, kind of less complex operations as so it doesn't drastically increase the gas cost due to the complexity of tracking the value. So the EMA is an instantaneous tracking value. The use case for the EMA is to record or is to report an instantaneous statistic that is a function of the balances in the pool. So something like fetching the BDV of a bean, or the BDV of the Bean-ETH token would use the EMA, as the EMA is tracking the instantaneous value. Something like determining the price of ETH in Bean in the pool would use the EMA. The ETH Bean price in the pool now would use the EMA. What's really nice about the EMA is that in order to calculate it, it only uses the previous balance, the previous value, and the new data point. So it's quite cheap to store on chain, as it can be summated. It only needs kind of one value to be stored on chain, in the fact that the last as the last EMA value. You compare this to something like Uniswap v3. Uniswap v3 uses an SMA even to track the instantaneous balances or value of something. Where this kind of, and this works fine, but it is incredibly expensive from a gas perspective, as it requires a sort of on-chain index of the corresponding balances in the pool at every timestamp over the desired range. So say you wanted to track an hour-long SMA, and there were trades in the pool in every block. It would require allocating 3,600 memory slots, which for every single block timestamp historically, and that only gets you to an hour. In allocating that much memory on chain, creating new variables is incredibly expensive. So, it would require a lot more gas to be either paid upfront or to be paid by users in order to allocate this kind of storage over time. In addition, read costs are quite expensive. It uses a binary search in order to, determine, because in order to compute the SMA, it needs to know the balances at the start of the SMA period. It uses a binary search, which is, log n time. So, say you had, again, the 3600, you wanted an hour-long look back, log 3600 is, I guess, about 3.5. So, which isn't too bad, honestly. So that would be, kind of 4 lookups in order to determine, so maybe around like, 10,000 gas. But kind of the point is that the SMA, using the SMA to determine the instantaneous value is relatively more expensive. Now, the third thing the well does is it uses an SMA to store, to calculate time-weighted average balances. So through using a cumulative sum similar to, kind of Uniswap's SMA, but only storing a running total, it can still allow averages over time to be calculated, such as for instances like the minting schedule, where Beanstalk wants the average over the course of the hour, not the instantaneous price. Also, Beanstalk has control of execution flow at the start and end of every desired time frame. Therefore, Beanstalk is able to would be able to query the cumulative balances, save them locally, and when it wants to calculate a time-weighted average, it has control of execution flow again, and then can query the balances and calculate the average over the time frame. This is very similar to how Uniswap v2 and Curve, I guess, used to function before they removed their on-chain oracles. So I guess, kind of to, talk through kind of some of this math, kind of looking in the update section, the first thing the pump does is, to use the new balances in the well to determine the manipulation protected last balances, which it can first converts it into log form, again, because it's cheaper to store, and the geometric balances take an input of balances already in log form. So it makes so doing the manipulation protection in log form also makes sense here. It basically sets a cap for the amount it's allowed to increase or decrease. Then it uses an EMA formula and an SMA formula to update the last the EMA and SMA or EMA and cumulative SMA balances, and then everything can be read by just taking 2 to the exponent of. The reason why 2 is used as a base is just because it's the cheapest. Most on-chain implementations of exponentiation and log, use 2 as their, only implement log 2 and solve for the, the ln by using the log 2. So that's a quick overview of the pump. Where things are at are, kind of, the code's pretty much wrapped up. Just, things are going to need a lot of testing, a lot of simulation testing. Would like to have, would like to ideally be able to, have some kind of graphics or statistics showcasing the effect of kind of, these different parameters. Ultimately, the DAO will need to make some sort of decision about what to set the A parameter on the EMA, and what to set the maximum % change in a block to protect against manipulation resistance. And it would be great to have some kind of visual data to aid in that decision. Other than that, just general cleanup. And it should be ready for audit.
Appreciate you walking through all that with so much detail, and I think it's helpful to have the design thinking behind that on the record. Go ahead. I saw you unmute.
Just would say, anyone who is interested or kind of inputting serious thought into potential manipulation attack vectors, it would be greatly appreciated. It's impossible to ideate and come up with every single way that someone might want to manipulate on-chain state variables. So, happy to have discussions with anyone who, wants to explore that a little bit more or has concerns about the implementation.
Great. So oh, go ahead, Pete's man.
I was just going to ask, are there any MEV experts who we know who we could ask just to take a look at this as well to see if they can come up with any possible manipulation methods?
Referrals welcome. I don't have much else to add there.
So maybe just, Pulis, could you give a 30-second or 2-minute summary on what remains in order to get to a point where wells can be proposed, a Bean-ETH well can be proposed as a BIP?
Yes. So that was also just about the wells, not for Bean-ETH well to be proposed as a BIP. But the short version is, first, the aquifer code needs to be finalized, which is the well registry, where wells are deployed through, and wells can be kind of looked up on chain. The second piece is the pump, which is the oracle, which allows manipulation-resistant proof of on-chain liquidity. And the third is the Beanstalk integration, which uses the pumps in order to determine the on-chain, value and delta B statistics in a given well, such that it can integrate well tokens into the silo and wells into the minting schedule.
Is the hope that as part of that BIP, we're also adding things like conversions to and from the well?
Yeah.
So what do you think the timeline is from now until a BIP being ready to be proposed?
Yeah, so was gonna comment on that briefly. I think that the, intention, assuming that the budget passes, is to also have, or at the moment anyway, the intention is to have Patrick Collins' audit firm called Cyphrin to review and audit the wells code, along with the other pieces that Publius described, like pumps, aquifers, and augers and such. So my current understanding is that's probably a month. Probably makes sense to, or I think we're pretty interested in exploring having setting up a code arena competition as well around wells and sort of test out that or do a proof of concept there for also having them look at various Beanstalk upgrades moving forward. And then as just like a matter of practice, I think that moving forward we're hoping to put up any undeployed code that will be deployed, whether it's a BIP or wells, for a couple weeks up on Immunify, given that the Immunify community has done a pretty good job, a pretty awesome job, really, of catching things in various BIPs and Beanstalk ecosystem code. So at that rate, other folks feel free to chime in, but sounding like about 7-8 weeks at this point. Cool. So had wanted to get to what else is left to ship and whitelist a Bean-ETH well. So I feel like we adequately covered that. Chad, could you briefly talk about your thoughts on like the middleware and, you know, in a subgraph, what would be necessary to index, you know, what kind of data, what kind of bots we could possibly, you know, potentially use in the Discord on that front, things like that?
Yeah, sure. For what it's worth, most of my time the last month has been focused pretty aggressively on making sure that the contract side code goes out smoothly to both auditors and such. So starting to gear up personally to spend more time on this, but we have some other engineers who've already been working on it and things are in progress. So I think to speak to the subgraph specifically, the subgraph is going to more or less index everything that the well is capable of doing. So on one front, it's going to index when wells are created in the aquifer, which is the decentralized registry. So anytime somebody deploys a well, it'll get picked up. And then on the individual well level, it's going to record all of the events that the well emits during the process of operation. So that's, you know, adding and removing of liquidity, swaps, and all of that kind of stuff. So it sort of the end result of that is that you'll be able to track liquidity and price and those sorts of things over time, and then look at individual transactions on the well and see what's going on, as well as read the components of the well through the subgraph. The components being any pumps that are attached, the well function, and the tokens that it was instantiated with. So that the initial part of that process, reading the well deployment, is done. Cujo is currently in the process of indexing the actual trading events. This particular subgraph is actually comparatively simple compared to the Beanstalk side, so not expecting it to be anything too crazy, and hoping to have that like the core functionality for that done by the end of this week, actually, at least in a test environment. Maybe to the rest of the middleware. So on the user interface front, several months back, we actually built out an initial version of the Wells UI. The way this worked was basically there's two components in the Beanstalk UI that would interact with Wells. The first is that just like you already have on the silo deposit page, basically we would add the Bean-ETH well as an item there, and then you could make a deposit into the well just by using the existing silo deposit interface. So it would just be basically a Bean-ETH token that's listed there. And then on that front, you'd also have the same trading functionality that you have currently, where you can select from a range of tokens in order to deposit liquidity into that well. And for what it's worth, one of the sort of other projects we've been working on over the last couple of months is to build out the Beanstalk SDK and implement it into the UI such that it can facilitate a number of different transactions, such as swapping from more tokens and et cetera, to allow more liquidity to flow with, I suppose, with less friction into the well. So an example of that would be, you know, say I have DAI and I want to deposit liquidity to the Bean-ETH well. Having the SDK's swap functionality correctly embedded in the UI allows you to just do all of that in one shot. So currently we support that for a number of routes, but because of the timeline in which that tech was built, some of the it's not sufficiently generalized to be able to work with arbitrary routes. So that's been a piece of the work that's been going on in the background that will hopefully allow more more assets to flow easily into the Bean-ETH well. The other side of the UI is that the market page will expand to basically split into both the pod market and then wells. So you'll be able to view individual wells and see liquidity over time and current reserves and all that kind of stuff in the Beanstalk UI directly. Maybe the last thing on the UI front is that we're considering what it would look like to go build out an independent wells UI. I think, at first glance, you could probably think of this as something like the sort of like the Uniswap UI, where it's very polished and focused and just more or less does one, to start does one thing, which is swap, but then, potentially can look at adding and removing liquidity there as well. But ultimately just trying to make the product as easy to use as possible. Beyond that, I think you can expect there to be a bot in Discord that's reading well events, at least for Bean-ETH. We haven't scoped out exactly which events it's going to send over. I know we have the exchange channel, which currently reads all exchanges on the Bean-ETH Recurve pool. So likely to start, we'll also have that. Though, hopefully as volume picks up, we may tone it down or do some sort of, hour by hour summary or something like that, which, all TBD there.
Sweet. Thanks for running through that. So I sort of figured part of this call would be discussing some of what you just shared, like where the Wells UI would be going, but it sounds like, is that already decided? Excuse me. That'll be like under the market page on the existing Beanstalk UI.
That's where we have it designed currently. Those components are basically already built out and just currently not visible. Happy to discuss that, and maybe Red Beans can speak more to that. I don't know if you've been thinking at all about this, but on my mind is looking towards doing an independent UI as well, which I think like it's probably going to take us. We should have a specific call about that one question, or we can do it now if you guys want.
Well, yeah. I mean, I don't think necessarily this call is necessarily to discuss specific implementations or designs of what a separate UI would look like, but yeah, talk about whether that's worth doing and why. But go ahead, Red Beans.
I think in the short term for the Bean-ETH well, what we have right now, like Chad was describing, that lives inside the market page and is like, one section of the market, and the components that exist to sort of read the data coming from the wells is sufficient. I was sort of hoping we could like zoom out like 2 or 3 layers here and sort of discuss like, what sort of,
Please,
at a UI level, like what do we really need to support for like Wells and Tractor in their end state? Because I think I sort of been thinking about this while I've been working on the pod marketplace as well, because we have this 3-dimensional chart, and that's going to be used for pods. But if the end state is that we're going to support lots of different assets with all sorts of different structures, it'd be nice to sort of like, I don't know, sort of discuss like what charting capabilities we need to, and I guess it goes beyond just charting, but even like how the ordering would work, so that we can have a sense of like how much of this UI can we sort of build in a modular fashion that can be reused for different, I don't know what to call it, products. Like you can imagine there being like a simple like Wells UI that lets you deposit into the silo and add liquidity to a well. But it sounds like it's going to be a lot more sort of complex and allow for a sort of a larger number of parameters that the user will be able to tweak. And so I don't know if I sort of have, I guess it's sort of an open question, and maybe want to discuss with Publius, a few levels out how we're thinking about all of this.
Yeah, maybe to speak a bit to that. So we talked in one of the last dev calls about, I think there's kind of two phases of Wells in terms of how an end user is going to be interacting with them outside of like, basic exchanging functionality. The first is, I think, Beanstalk Farms will deploy its Bean-ETH and other Bean-ETH well and other wells for common pairs that we want Bean to trade against, and ultimately the underlying components for those are likely going to be Beanstalk Farms developed, or at least developed in the sense that we work with open source developers who want to contribute there. Right now we have the constant product 2, which is basically the same as what Uniswap, the Uniswap XY equals K function does. obviously we're looking towards doing some sort of stable swap pricing function as well, which I think is probably the one of the next ones up. But ultimately, we'll have that sort of library of functions and some wells deployed with those. I think the second phase, and maybe Publius can talk more about this, is the phase in which the pricing functions themselves start getting used by independent users to do things like create a limit order or something like that, which is getting far more into the side of where a user is going to need to do some sort of customization, deploy the well themselves, all of that kind of stuff. I think the way in which somebody does that or will do that is still pretty unclear, and probably what we need to do first is to mock out what some examples of those pricing functions would be. Like, how exactly would a limit order pricing function work, and who's going to be using that, and do they need to deploy a well, or is there some other way that to set that up, for example? And so that's a whole design discussion that I think the engineering there would probably inform on the interface front what's going to happen. But I personally tend to think that and I'd love to open this up for discussion, because I think it's probably a point of uncertainty at this stage. I personally think that in the short to medium term, the thing to think about with respect to the interface is making it as clear as possible that wells as a whole kind of slots into this world of being being a DEX, much like other products which it will compete against. And then secondarily, to highlight that it's it is better on the axes, which we've made it better on, right? In the sense that it's cheaper in gas terms, and liquidity providers can earn stock and seniorage and all of those sorts of things. So that to me strikes me as like a more sort of traditional UI approach. Like, we don't need to get into anything too fancy with charting at this stage. But yeah, I mean, I'd love to hear if anybody disagrees on that front, or maybe if Publius has some other comments in terms of how it might move more towards that complex world sooner rather than later.
So can I ask a high level question to Red Bean's point about zooming out? And maybe this is a question that Publius can help me with or help me understand, which is, I guess I'm trying to understand if the market as like a Beanstalk module, or like the marketplace facet, which allows farmers to trade pods, even makes sense or needs to exist in a world where all of this tractor functionality we've talked about is fully implemented. Or at that point, is the market not even really necessary as a part of Beanstalk, and farmers just use Depot to do all of those things?
I can go ahead.
Go ahead.
Publius. Cool. Yeah, you got it.
So it's all the same. Kind of. So what Tractor is, and what this generalized on-chain marketplace is just the underlying on-chain trustless secure code that executes the orders and allows for order creation. To a user, think from a user perspective.
Right.
Having
I'm trying to
some
inform our discussion around like this Wells UI and where all this stuff lives.
Yeah. So from a user perspective, a good user interface should make it very clear to the user what they're doing, what they're trying to buy, what they're buying with, what type of transaction is it. Users shouldn't be creating these complex transactions that are sent to Depot or Tractor or whatever. Users should just be interacting with an interface that is likely specific to the type of exchange or market they're working with. The goal is to minimize on-chain computation and on-chain code. And that is why it makes sense from an on-chain perspective to create something that's super generalized. But the end product to the user likely is going to be more specific, in a sense that, when you go, you're in a marketplace where people are buying and selling pods. Because the way that the UI needs to structure things to users needs to be such that the UI needs to actually interpret what's in the order so that it can tell you what you're buying and what you're selling and convey kind of liquidity to users in a specific, helpful way based on the type of marketplace it is. So there truly is a lot of work that needs to be done to build out things like the Beanstalk market, where one can imagine there's a deposit marketplace, a plot marketplace, a fertilizer marketplace, maybe an ERC20 token order marketplace where you can buy and sell unripe assets in bulk or something. These, although the tech stack on the back end is going to be sufficiently generalized, custom middleware and UI still needs to be built to allow and enable these marketplaces.
Great. And so that's super helpful personally. So when you talk about, having a FERT marketplace, a plot marketplace, etc., to what extent do those require changes to Beanstalk or not?
They don't require, again, like it can require a lot of changes or a little changes, depend how things are ultimately implemented. But in the context of Tractor, Tractor supports the ability to spend standardized tokens, ERC20, 1155, 721, deposits, Beanstalk deposits, and plots on behalf of the user. Through having access to be able to use a user's given value or assets in a transaction, Tractor can then perform any number of sequential function calls based on, using those assets as an input. And then any asset it supports, which again is currently the ERC20 token standards, deposits, and plots, can then be outputted to the fulfiller and or any other specified user. So through this logic, kind of given Tractor's implemented that way, there are no changes required for Beanstalk in order to implement and standardize, or in order to use Tractor to its fullest potential. As one can imagine a Tractor function call, let's take the example of you want to create an order to buy a plot on top of your deposit. And let's start breaking down what's actually in that Tractor order. So first, I create an order. The first thing it does is it transfers some number of deposits to someone else, and the input about how much or what season or seasons can be set by the user. Now, let's say I'm totally adverse to, or I don't need any grown stock. I don't care. I just want the BDV, I don't want, So yeah, I guess then, to make it more complex, I guess I'm the one selling in this case. I'm the one buying plots in this order, in this case, selling the deposit. But so let's say, I set some sort of pricing function where, I'm willing to, value deposits at this base value of the BDV. Or I guess in this case, wait, apologies. Yes, so I'm willing to, let's back up a bit, I guess. So maybe let's take the case where I'm willing to buy a plot with some of my deposits, right? Great. So the first thing is a transfer of deposits from me to, let's say, the fulfiller of the order or some address that they input. And then they also input the amounts and seasons. Perhaps I have a function that verifies that those seasons are within a particular range. Maybe I'm only willing to trade deposits that are season 6,000 or later, in a sense that they have less grown stock. So now this order takes, it says it verifies that all of the seasons the fulfiller inputs are, of season 6,000 or greater. Now I'm willing to buy pods, maybe at a valuation where it's like each deposit is 1 BDV plus some maybe linear scalar times the amount of grown stock on top of the deposit. Maybe that linear scalar is 0, meaning all deposits are valued equally, but kind of there's some way to, based on the amounts and seasons that the user inputs, determine some type of valuation of the amount of value that is being transacted. Again, it could just be a summation of the BDV. And then, so, kind of the first function, again, is a transfer. The second function is verifying that the deposits are within the range I want. Either that same function or a third function then summates the value of the deposits. And then the fourth function takes in the plot and range that the user is willing to sell, and maybe outputs the price. And that, then kind of that, another function will compare that the price is of like equal to or less than value than the amount of, or equal to or greater than value than the BDV that's being transferred to them. And then the final step would be transferring that plot back. So this tractor transaction is quite complex in nature, and that there's a lot going on under the hood. But the point is, from an on-chain perspective, once the technology is built, kind of support for all the, details and intermittent functionality. Maybe this user wants some custom conditions about the deadline, when this order expires, how many times the order can be executed, what the total amount of BDV they're willing to buy or pods they're willing to buy. But kind of, and so it's like, from an on-chain perspective, what this tractor order is taking in is just a bunch of encoded data. The kind of the middleware layer and the UI are going to decode that data and determine what things actually mean, and kind of accumulate all orders of similar structures and types that are these transferred deposits or BDV equivalent. Ideally a UI would be able to group deposits with people just willing to buy beans, and even better, like it could kind of somehow intermingle all of them based on some shared valuation formula. And I can say, and maybe I, as a user, I'm willing to, also sell my fertilizer for pods at this price, or sell pods later in line for pods earlier in line. But kind of the point is that, kind of this composable structure of any asset can be traded for any asset based on any arbitrary conditions is created.
Thanks for the
So,
walkthrough. Yeah, I have
just want to go back
other
to
questions, but I'll let folks hop.
Just one thing, just want to go back to the main point that you were making there, Publius, which is that from a user perspective, the experience is the same, whether the order is being created through Tractor or through a well. And functionally, the only question, economically, the only question is whether to use Tractor or a well, is effectively whether you want the liquidity to be provable on chain in some capacity. So be used for liquidations or be used for some oracle. That's the basic difference from a functionality perspective, and from a creating orders, trading against orders, whether they're tractor orders or well orders. That user experience should basically be perfectly meshed together. And therefore, the discussion around where to host what markets and how to present that to users should not really be had in the context of wells versus tractor. It should be more in the general context of the user experience.
So you're bifurcating, just so I understand it. The bifurcation here is like, if a user needs to prove the liquidity exists on chain, they would go, I don't know, maybe through a different experience that would tweak a different number of parameters. Otherwise, they would be using Tractor under the hood. But I guess the UX up to that point would probably be the same. And then when you're, queuing the order, for lack of a better term, that's where maybe the experience would be different. Is that correct? Am I understanding that correctly?
Sure. So if you're creating an order, you go through the order creation, and then there's an option given to you. Do you want to use Tractor or a well, effectively? But I think at that point, there is some question as to what the functionality parity will be between wells and Tractor at given points in time. I think that to start, Tractor functionality will probably be more broad in terms of on-chain capacities, but then as Publius was saying, there's a middleware question, whereas wells functionality is limited on-chain independent of middleware until there's further upgrades made. So this discussion can't be had in the perfectly generalized sense. It must be taken somewhat in the context of feature parity, but generally, yes, up until the very last stage in the order creation process, the whole thing should generally probably be abstracted from the user.
Okay, that's helpful. It sounds like, if I'm hearing this correctly, it's like, we're gonna sort of launch Bean-ETH well with sort of a limited version of wells, and releasing, these individual markets in the future will require, because wells are so generalized, it's going to require, maybe more work on the middleware side of things to create an interface that somebody can use to interact with said well. Do you have a sense of, which markets or come to mind in terms of priority that sort of we should be thinking about first, as opposed, obviously Bean-ETH in the near future, but on the medium term, how do they all kind of rank against each other?
Rank in terms of what, like, how define the axes of priority.
In terms of what should get built first, if it's going to be some amount of custom work on the middleware side of things to I don't know, release a different market.
I think that's a great question. Don't know if I have strong opinions on this topic just yet, and would be curious to hear what other people have to say.
Just to clarify, when you say release a market, Sweered, you just mentioned ETH Bean as a market. Is it safe to say that a market could mean a pair of tokens, aka a well instance?
Yeah, I believe so, if I'm understanding it correctly. You could have a pair of tokens, you could have deposits and pods, you could have it sounds like it can be arbitrary, if I'm understanding it correctly. So I think the implication of that is there needs to be probably more work done on the middleware side of things and the UI side of things to make a UI where somebody can use some asset to trade against a different one. Like, I don't, because they're not ERC20s, I don't think it would be as simple as like a swap module or something, if that makes sense.
Kind of. I'm just a little confused here, right? Like, we should be talking about products and not how we implement them necessarily, because this conversation almost feels like, hey, we have this thing called a function, and we're going to use this function to do this one thing. What's the next thing that we're going to use the function for? Rather than like, hey, we're going to build a DEX, and as a precursor to building that DEX, we're going to just start with one well, Bean-ETH, and it's going to be deployed in the existing Beanstalk UI. But then once we have a second or a third well, aka a pair of tokens, maybe USDC and Bean, maybe whatever, then we're going to build the product, the actual DEX with its own UI and blah, 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 right? Or we talk about a separate kind of product. We talk about, replacing our pod marketplace with tractor functionality under the hood, potentially. I'm not saying we should do that, but.
Yeah. I think this is a great point, which is that it's going to be very helpful for all of us to think in more concrete terms about exactly what things are being exchanged. That way it's just a little easier to visualize than talking about some, too much, arbitrary end dimension, all of that kind of stuff, in my personal opinion. So I'd say that with respect to wells, I mean, the clearest markets, if you want to call them that, but it's just to start is just deploying wells for tokens that people want to trade in DeFi, right? And I think we have a pretty clean understanding of at least some number of tokens that would fit into that world. And there may be some additional dev work to do around creating new well functions that support new combinations of those tokens for gas efficiency. An easy example would be, I think we could consider deploying a multi-token stable swap implementation, somewhat like 3Pool, which has get low cost exchange of some number of stables, which is effectively what the Bean-ETH recurve pool is doing already, but now it's in wells, right? So I think that's something that we could look towards concretely on that front. Then on the tractor side, I mean, ultimately, at the end of the day, it is capable of just running some sequence of actions on chain, and like you can execute the other side. But what you actually build with that, and specifically down to like what's being traded and what's the point, I think is the key question. So I think the most concrete example we can look at right now is basically thinking about the pod market, and notably the change with implementing the pod market using Tractor, which the fact that it's using Tractor doesn't really matter all that much from a UX standpoint. But the UX improvement specifically that this would enable is placing orders for pods denominated in other things that we have currently. And I think even more concretely than that, like we can think about placing orders for pods using deposited beans, which currently is not possible. And frankly, I think probably contributes to a liquidity problem of sorts on the market because of the fact that in order to place an order, you have to remove your beans from the silo and then deposit them in an order on the market and not earn seigniorage and so or earn stock for that matter either. And so I think like if we can imagine a world even just to start where the first feature is like place orders for pods using deposits, one concrete change would be that we'd see more liquidity on the pod market and more exchanges of pods, and ultimately think that moving pods on the pod market is good for Beanstalk because having liquidity on pods reduces the risk of minting new pods in some sense. At least that's how I view it, and would be curious if others feel differently.
It just feels like that would be a huge undertaking to replace the pod marketplace with tractors, right? Like that would be correct me if I'm wrong, but that would be quite a heavy migration.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
To speak briefly to it, I'm happy to dig into like what it would take to make that work. It's definitely not simple, though. For a single use case like the pod market, we might be able to build something that is a stepping stone to the fully generalized solution. But that's more of a technical discussion, which we can have now or later. But happy to do it. But yes, it would be significant.
So then, from a resource thing, do we have the capability to do both of these efforts in parallel, or do we need to prioritize one versus the other?
Depends on how we do it. I mean, my personal opinion is that the fully generalized form of Tractor is like a gargantuan engineering task. Now, I think if we can get very specific about what the end UX needs to be for the various things that use Tractor, then we can probably sequence this out such that there's a version which reasonably quickly is able to operate something like a pod market, right? I think that something like that is probably on the order of like, call it 1 to 2 quarters for a team of a couple engineers to do, if assuming that we're kind of pointed at 1 or 2 concrete use cases. I think the generalized version, particularly one that can scale with lots of orders, is probably years of development. But I don't say that to scare us off, but also just to sort of to look at things in that perspective, because I think like this is going to be a long march, and so we might as well think about now, like where we want to place the first milestone. And my personal opinion is that we should place it something closer rather than farther out.
But just to go back to my question,
can I reset it a little bit? I feel like, I mean, to the point earlier about getting concrete. Personally, I'm asking questions to try to understand and feel like it's harder to have the higher order conversations without everyone on the same page first. And also feel like, think that it's important to talk about, development in context of the resources we have or hope to have, but also feel like, simply talking about what the perfect interface would look like helps us all understand the underlying technology better. But hard to disagree with anything you've said, but I don't think that makes it not worth having the conversation.
Well, could you suggest a question to reframe?
Well, so personally found Publius is talking through like the various possible marketplaces, Beanstalk markets, like, you know, FERT plots and deposits. And, you know, they were talking about this example of, yeah, you could, you know, trade pods at one part of the line for pods at another part of the line, trade deposits, trade some ERC20 token, and have that all be arbitrary. And so I guess I'm wondering, you know, in that context, like, is the vision for what a perfect interface would look like actually separate marketplaces for, you know, fertilizer, pods, etc. I'm just trying to understand what that could possibly look like as an end state. Again, you know, this is I mean, lots of development work out, but just trying to understand that better personally.
Well, the assets themselves have different properties, right? Like obviously pods are ordinal, tokens aren't, etc. So like the interface used to place orders on those has to be different on an asset by asset basis, even if it's just like you got to type in another field, you know, and that doesn't even start to get into the visualization side. So I imagine that because of that, you would have to bifurcate in some way, like different market sections. Maybe way down the road, there's a way to like, you know, create the indexer for everything and like, you know, aggregate all willingness to exchange something for any number of other things. But to me that, and kind of why I brought it back to the pod market specifically, though I think the other markets that Publius mentioned are also probably, you know, concrete and nearby. Just like, I'm not sure that there's a good way to start at that point and work backwards currently. I would kind of take it from the other direction and think more about what the immediate or the more immediate needs are in terms of exchanging things and apply Tractor to those. But yeah.
Cool. Just trying to make the point that you know, don't think anyone's suggesting we you know, replace the pod market next month or anything like that. And feel like, at least for me anyway, and you know, maybe I'm alone in that, but feel like the discussion itself is useful. So maybe, Chad, you had mentioned, you know, earlier in the conversation, setting up this, you know, initial interface for wells in the Beanstalk UI. So I guess I'm curious, from your perspective, like what's the argument for doing that rather than like a separate interface? And maybe the only argument is, you know, resources at the moment, but curious to hear your take.
Yeah, I think Red Beans can probably speak better to that, but I'm open to doing both. We already have the existing one because that was the direction we chose to go before. I personally think that doing an independent one that focuses on making swaps very, very simple would be advantageous, but that's my opinion.
Why? How would it be more simple than like? And maybe I'm sort of missing what happens after Bean-ETH, but wouldn't you really, you know, for the immediate future, only be able to swap Bean-ETH using this, you know, said separate UI?
Sure. I mean, after the immediate deployment, though, I think a related roadmap item, which I'd like to get to, is, you know, why not go deploy a number of other pools quickly thereafter, particularly ones that would make sense in a constant product to pricing world. But yeah, in any case, like, yeah, I hear you there.
Are there other? Go ahead, Al. Sorry.
Sorry.
Is Craig still in the call? I don't see Craig.
Shit.
Who?
Let me see. One sec.
Who?
You know what? I think Canadian Bennett messaged me that he was recording on his computer as well, so we should be good. But I'll also add him for good measure.
Anyways, I was going to ask.
Now recording.
I was going to ask. I kind of agree with Chad here. We really need to kind of set a flag in the ground here and say, are we or are we not building a DEX, right? Because there's a difference between deploying a well for Bean-ETH that's just going to sit inside the current Beanstalk interface, right, and just be used as another whitelisted token versus building a DEX with 1 or 2 or 3 or whatever many pools available, right? Because if we're committing to saying like, hey, we're going to build a DEX and everything that we do kind of leads towards that, similarly to how we're building all this foundational technology because we're forward thinking and future thinking, and any step we take now should also be a step towards this future goal. Then if that future goal is a DEX, then that drives the decisions for this first stepping stone, which is the Bean-ETH pool, right? And kind of what Chad was saying, that if we are targeting a DEX, then we should deploy the first Bean-ETH pool and its surrounding supporting, UX, adding liquidity, blah, 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 potentially in a separate UI, right? But if we're saying like, no, a DEX is not this close, it's maybe further off, or maybe we don't even want to do it, someone else will do it, then that drives the decision, makes it very clear that the UI for the Bean-ETH pool will stay in the current page, in the current dApp, in the Bean dApp. So
I mean, maybe it can be both, right? Like maybe the DEX, which is clearly being built, to your point, Al, it's like there is a DEX being built. Maybe that should launch when the Bean-ETH well launches the UI to host the DEX. And I guess really the only question is if there's a UI for it. But sure, it's a good question to put a stake in the ground. But I, at least philosophically, feel like in perpetuity, the Beanstalk UI that is maintained by Beanstalk Farms should really be like a one-stop shop to interact with Beanstalk, and you shouldn't have to go to a separate site. And so just want to push back on the thing you said there, that the decision on if we're building a DEX should affect whether the Bean-ETH well is supported on the Beanstalk website or the Bean.money website. Feel like the logic kind of works in the other direction, where if we're building a well, then it may make sense to also have a separate UI through which you can interact with the Bean-ETH well, but not like, to me, the causality works only in the direction of supporting a separate UI and not, basically doesn't affect at all the Bean.money website.
So
Complete, or go ahead.
Sorry, I was going to kind of just clarify there what that literally would mean, right? So let's pretend we're not building our own DEX, even wells, that we would deploy liquidity on Uniswap, right? Bean-ETH on Uniswap, just as before. Well, what does that mean in terms of UI requirements for Beanstalk Farms for Bean.money app, right? It's exactly what we have today, right? Just adding another whitelisted token and just making sure that the token shows up in the supported swaps and deposits, right? And that's it. So that doesn't really mean adding new pages or new sections. It's just expanding the stuff that we have to support this new LP token or the new whatever swaps. Versus if we have a well, that might require some extra, UI maybe to see the amount of TVL that it has and like all this other like DEX related like activities, right? So that's kind of where I was going with that.
But do you not understand that like a well is being built and that we need that stuff for the well? Like, what is it? It seems like a rhetorical question you're asking.
Sorry, I'm a little lost. I don't know what I'm asking.
So we have first of all, I agree that like when it comes to the functionality that the Beanstalk UI currently supports, the main entry point is just going to be you have a page that's basically on the silo where it says Bean-ETH and you just deposit there, right? Like that's the first use case. Then there's also supporting that pool when swapping between Bean and ETH on the swap page, which is just an upgrade to the SDK. So that infrastructure is there, right? Then there's the question of if you wanted to have some sort of, like the Uniswap, info site where you can see wells, you can look at their liquidity, all that kind of stuff, see trades. That currently we have a design for would be nested under the market, right? So it would basically bifurcate the market page into wells and into pods, and then you click wells and you can see all of the wells, right? Now, out of the gate, there's only going to be one well, so how useful that really is something we should probably discuss more, but that design does exist. When referring to a specific UI, I think in part we're talking about deploying basically one place that or one website that maybe simplifies and focuses specifically on wells, so there's not all this other Beanstalk stuff in it. It's a little bit easier to link to, faster to load, works on mobile, all that kind of stuff. But secondarily, it sort of cements what I think maybe Al, you were trying to get to at the beginning, this idea that like the DEX is a product, right? And like if we want other people to deploy wells eventually, like should probably be a place to talk about that, or maybe to even actually do the deployment. There should be a place that indexes all of the pricing functions and the pumps and all of that sort of stuff. And so I think maybe that like wells as a holistic product mindset is what I'm really trying to get at when thinking about the independent UI.
Yeah, agree wholeheartedly, and that's what I meant by like the flag in the ground. Like, are we going towards that? And if we are, that drives a lot of things, especially once we decide that is the priority compared to like upgrading marketplace and other things. So that's a decision that we need to make. If it hasn't been made already, if it has, then it should just be more clear that we're going to build a product that competes with Curve and Uniswap, and then let's define what that roadmap is and how we like.
I mean, I feel like that is true in the medium term, but it sounds like in the long term that this is going to be a lot. There's more to wells than like a Uniswap fork, and so I think the questions I was sort of asking is to like discover how do we sort of be thinking about what the end state of this UI should look like so that we can sort of design in step with that. Like I don't want to just like take. And I know that the UI that we have for wells currently is basically just like almost exactly what exists for inspecting like Uniswap v2 pools. But I guess I'm just sort of
yeah, but just because wells can do all this other stuff doesn't matter to us right now, because the product that we're trying to build is a DEX that swaps tokens, right? And that's all we're focusing on right now. So I don't see the need to explore other UIs unless we have like a target product and problems that we're trying to solve for.
So I guess is the suggestion then that we just sort of like take Uniswap's UI and set it up at some other URL that it's just bean swap or something? Is that sort of what you guys are thinking?
I mean, yeah. Why would we not think that? What else would there be?
I don't know that it would be necessarily a clone like that. I think you're right that like there's obvious differences with wells, and like going back to what I said earlier in terms of there's pricing functions that we deploy, which we can list all of those sorts of things. I mean, it definitely worth a discussion. Like, is it worth doing if it's very similar to something like what Uniswap already has deployed? Not that we need to anchor too much to them. I guess like I understand your point though, getting towards like what does the end state of this look like, and I think like maybe to just quickly gesture at it, and I'd be curious what Publius has to say here. But on the wells front, it's like the main difference when you go way down the road between wells and something like Uniswap, aside from having this growth in different forms of pricing functions and oracles, is just that users can deploy their own well with a pricing function that sort of creates an order. And it's basically provable on-chain liquidity with a custom order, right? So how the order is customized, to me, greatly affects what the UI looks like, right? Like I think the limit order example maybe starts to get at this, where it's like, well, if the pricing function is a limit order, then you need like some way to encode the limit order, right? But the problem with backing into the end vision now is that all of the UI is going to be dependent on in what ways do people want to price things, right? Or to like create orders, and what pricing functions are available from a technical perspective, and what are their parameters. And so I think the only way to start tackling that problem is to go start like looking at that sphere of options, and maybe coming up with some examples and their parameters, and then thinking about how a user might input those. But I think like, yeah, it just seems a little too fuzzy right now to come up with anything beyond that. And then on the tractor side, I think, the situation is very similar, in which the core technology is like execute a bunch of things in a sequence on chain arbitrarily between two parties. And like the ways that can unfold, I guess, are so numerous that, we can start to think about some of the common use cases like token exchanges or, deposits for pods and all that kind of stuff. And those are the UIs that we probably want to dig into now.
But I'm going to push back here. Why do we need to dig into like possible tractor UIs? What's the product that we're building that needs tractor? That's the question. What
is it? I mean, it's a DEX, man. Like, we're building a DEX. It's Wells. We're building this decentralized exchange where you can sort of.
Great.
Sorry, go ahead.
Help me understand, because I genuinely don't understand. What part of a DEX would you require using a tractor?
From I think there are a couple of ways to look at what a DEX is. There's a DEX from a kind of an on-chain, a actual creation of orders, a representation of the state of the financial transactions that people want to engage in, versus the user interface that's delivered to someone engaging with such a product. From the kind of the on-chain perspective, there are two different DEXs being built. There's the DEX that is encompassed by Wells. There's a DEX that's encompassed by Tractor. Now, from a user experience, the DEX that's being delivered to users should be an aggregate of every on-chain DEX, right? Like, the best user experience is an aggregation of all on-chain data and conveying what users where they should go to perform some sort of financial activity. Whether someone is swapping Bean-ETH between a Bean-ETH well or a limit order, and that limit order could be on Tractor, it could be a well. To the user, it doesn't matter from the perspective of when they're trading. So the product that is the user-facing DEX is kind of different in a sense than the existence of on-chain DEXs, and I think kind of having separation there is important. Like when even viewing analytics, viewing liquidity with Bean and ETH, like it should show the liquidity on Wells and the liquidity on Tractors. And to kind of Sweet Red's point earlier about kind of trying to distinguish the UI between them, ultimately the only thing that matters is the gas kind of difference between the two, the security assumptions between the two, which is censorship resistance potentially via off-chain, and kind of how it and what it implies for the rest of DeFi. And it's hard because where they start is so different. The fact that and getting to the idea of what should be in a well versus what should be in Tractor, is very much so a matter of how long will it take to build Tractor and how long will it take to build the Wells equivalents. Limit orders, something that are being constantly updated, it's unclear what the best way to implement it is from the perspective of on-chain versus off-chain. Because on-chain, again, it's only valuable if there's provable liquidity for it. So limit orders on-chain could be represented, either in a permissioned or permissionless way, but the permissionless way is going to be much more gas inefficient, as it's going to require users to be like transferring liquidity between different wells, but it's possible. But from a perspective of so it's like if either it's implemented on-chain with provable liquidity, or it should be implemented with Tractor. The only reason to implement it with wells with non-provable liquidity, such as like a permission limit order, that someone might each user has their own well function where they're just updating the buy and sell price. The only reason to do that on a well is because the functionality required for Tractor is not yet supported. And ultimately, the indexing for both is going to be relatively similar, as whatever software is indexing will need to know how to distinguish a well and be able to distinguish, the Tractor equivalent.
Sure, but here's the thing. We're talking about whether or not to build limit orders with wells or Tractors, but we haven't even decided that we're building a DEX necessarily. And building limit orders should be like a pretty big topic in and of itself, whether or not.
When you say we haven't decided if we're building a DEX, what do you mean? Like, what do you mean by that? Who hasn't decided what? The DEX is like 90% done on chain. Sweet Red Beans has been working on DEX related UI stuff for months. Like, what are you asking? What
Well,
do you
there's
say?
a difference between having the well contracts and having the Bean-DEX product, right?
But what is the product?
That's exactly what I'm trying to get to, right? Like imagine curve.fi or curve.exchange. That is a product. Let's imagine a future Bean.
But what makes it a product?
Well, there's a UI on top of it, and it has a brand, and it has a specific set of features that interact with one or more contracts, right? Like it's a thing, right? It's not just either a contract.
So
that just
you're
sits out
asking
there.
about a UI. Are we going to build a separate UI?
Well, more than, yes, effectively yes, but more than just the UI. But yes, is it going to be a separate UI, and are we going to think about this as its own standalone product versus just a pool that is going to be absorbed into Bean.money, right? And we're kind of already made that distinction, right? So when I said like it hasn't been decided yet, I understand that we're kind of deciding, right? Like it's kind of decided, right? So that was like a fuzzy question. It sounds like we're building a DEX. It just hasn't been made like official, and we're still debating whether it's going to be a separate UI with a separate brand name with a separate domain, right? Versus having just one pool,
100%.
Right?
And that is very much still in question. If anything, that was the question that was initially brought up that got this discussion started. But I actually want to use this as an opportunity to just talk from a theoretical perspective about how the nature of the tech that we're all working on makes this question like less of a fundamental question than you are making it out to be. So in a traditional Web 2 environment where all of the tech or the majority of the tech that you're working on and building is proprietary, ultimately the product that you're creating, as you were saying, Albin, is the primary thing to define. Whereas in our case, there is a fundamental difference between, and this is like because of the nature of all this tech is open source, and we don't even necessarily need to host the website or the product where wells are used in order to reap the benefits of wells. But the concept is the nature of the tech that we're building makes it fundamentally different in terms of optimization, where defining the product first, particularly as you defined it, Al, being like what is the brand, what is the place where users are actually going to interact with the product, the user interface to some extent, that in our case is entirely different from the tech that we are building. And they are almost two totally different questions. And from that perspective, the building of the technology really needs to be answered in its own context. So wells and tractor are being designed from a generalization and composability perspective such that whatever products people want to be built using the DEX can be. And that makes it such that the answers to what is the product being built actually answerable by a much larger group of people. Again, in a Web 2 context, you have to define the product because you're building all the tech to use the product or to create a product. Whereas in our case, we're building tech such that infinite products can be used and created. And that is the fundamental answer to the question we were having earlier in the DAO call around real economic activity. It's we don't even necessarily want to be responsible, and I'd say we in that case as the DAO, responsible for figuring out what beans are going to be used for. We just want to lower all of the friction around using beans for real economic activity to as low a point as possible such that there is real use. So the whole concept of we have to define what is being built from a product perspective first, to me is a little bit off the mark. And we need to instead be building from a perspective of what is and I guess maybe to push back on what I'm saying, the on-chain capabilities and arguably the indexing, so the middleware that makes all the data usable, those are things that really should be done in the most generalized context. Whereas the front end it's much harder to make a great user experience that's totally generalized. And the hope is that there are lots of different products that are building on top of the back end and the middleware stack that we're building. But it's hard to get a sense of what the middleware should be doing, particularly in the short term, if we don't know what all the products being built using the back end are. And that is something that I think it would be helpful to just, have some of the other ecosystem participants talk about what they're building and how they might want to use Wells or Tractor, and that could perhaps guide some more discussion in a meaningful way on what are the products that are being built, and therefore how should the middleware support them.
Yeah, look, you're right. We are building, there's two tracks here. There's the protocol track, which is building something super generalized, and all the conversations within the design of that system need to think generically, right? 100% agree. But I thought this was a conversation about specifically what Beanstalk's next product is going to be, which is this idea of a DEX, right? So now I'm shifting gears from the generalized
I don't think that was what this call was about generally. I think the goal of these...
Oh, I was saying that the spot on the call where we started talking about the DEX and whether we put the UI, and that's...
the call can be whatever you want it to be, but the point is that what we're trying to figure out is what we're all doing here, right? So it's not, you're saying it is, what are we building a DEX? I think it's even more general, which is we're trying to get aligned with everybody, with the DAO in general. We're doing this in a public setting. Go ahead.
Sorry, there's different layers of this conversation that are being had. There's, at some point, we were discussing, Chad asked the question of where do we put the UI for the Bean-ETH pool, right? When we're talking about the Bean-ETH pool, we're no longer talking about generalized protocol stuff. We're talking about a specific instance of use of that, of Wells. So in order to answer the question of where do we put the functionality and the UI for the Bean-ETH pool, this is where I started drawing the line towards, well, it would help to know if we plan on building a DEX. That's a standalone product, because if we are, then we can do things one way. But if we're not, then we do things a different way.
What would be the difference from your perspective?
Well, just like Chad was saying, one big part is, this info page, right? About the well and all the details about its liquidity and all that stuff. If we don't have our own DEX, right, then that gets deployed with the already designed page and we're up and running and shipped very quick. Versus if we want to have a DEX that looks like its own standalone DEX and competes with Curve, then we got to have like that's a whole endeavor. That's a big endeavor that we need to kind of systematically plan for and have a roadmap.
In all seriousness, in your like, other than the fact that we're having this call to do exactly what you're talking about, in your work as someone that's working on the SDK and the middleware in particular, how does it actually matter whether we're the one building the DEX or whether someone else goes and builds the DEX on the stuff that we're building from the perspective of what you're working on? Like, isn't the goal to facilitate someone to build a DEX, and then it's up to the UI team to figure out when we can get, and if we want to get
from the point of view of the SDK, my specific task, it doesn't affect me. So I wasn't raising these questions from my particular day-to-day job function.
But then I have to push back on the way that you're participating in the discussion a little bit, because you're asking all these meta questions. It's a little too meta. We are literally having the discussion right now. So I think let's try to keep it a little bit more substantive and a little bit less about what are we doing here, because we're actually doing it. So I really do appreciate your participation tremendously. But I think it would be much more productive if we kept this a little bit more substantive and come at this from the perspective of, go ahead.
As substantive as it gets. I don't think I'm being meta at all. I'm trying to get us to be very concrete. Are we building a thing or are we building this other thing? But I'll let it go.
But it's important to be concrete, but I think the point is that we're literally having the discussion about whether to host a DEX website separate from Bean.money, and somehow the conversation has gone into the meta conversation about building products and what are products and how do we build them and what product are we building now and is it a DEX? So this has gotten way too meta, and in practice, I think this hasn't answered the question as to whether or not we're building a separate UI, but would make the argument that in practice the answer is quite apparent, which is there may or may not be a Wells DEX page that supports the deployment of Wells, and in practice, maybe even the deployment of tractor orders, the aggregation of on-chain data, as Publius was saying, to create a great user experience to trade all different stuff. But that really does seem to be a large undertaking, and one that is probably better off taken by some team that wants to build a DEX using all this tech. Whereas in our case, the Bean.money website should be able to support a variety of different markets, as Publius was talking about, and as Guy mentioned as well, with Beanstalk native assets. Now,
Well,
go ahead.
I'd say two things there. So first, to me, supporting a variety of, sort of like variety of assets in the abstract is more meta than what we were talking about previously. But maybe we can dig into that a little bit more specifically. But secondarily, I think the thing that you're saying here perhaps is even is a shift in perspective. Even it is for myself, and perhaps it is for others, which is that you're describing the nature of things here as, we go build Wells, and then somebody comes in and builds a DEX on Wells, right? And if that's the case, then I'm not sure that spending that much time digging deeply into the UI discussion matters that much at all. And perhaps what we should be doing is hunting for a person or a group of people to go work on that specific product and communicating to them how the back end tech works, more or less. But until then, if that's actually the framing in which we're looking at this, and it's not the responsibility of Beanstalk Farms, which I might push back on some. I think that's a totally different ballgame. So if we want to go that route, we might need to reconsider here.
Would think about it differently and say that it's probably more reasonable that some DEX specific team spins out from the Beanstalk DAO. And to your point, Chad, it may make sense to be looking for people to do that ultimately. But there's a question as to Beanstalk Farms has limited resources and cannot be doing everything. The main function is, at least as we understand it, is for Beanstalk Farms to facilitate complete and full access to the Beanstalk protocol. And particularly given as the on-chain capabilities of Beanstalk-related code have increased, that has become almost an impossible thing to answer in practice, excuse me. And it seems like the concept of now having Beanstalk Farms build out the Bean.money website for interacting with Beanstalk, a separate DEX, at some point the scope becomes too large for one particular organization, and it's quite centralized. And so at least from our perspective, the goal of building composable and generalized tech is that it makes it really easy for different groups that want to do similar and related stuff to spin out and be complementary or supplementary. And so the concept is one of the reasons why the Bean.money website code being open source was so important is that maybe people want to create a slightly different user experience to interact with the protocol. And lowering the friction to doing that as much as possible is really the
I think we lost you the last 10 seconds or so.
now. Can you hear me now?
Can hear you now.
Yep.
Where did you lose me? Sorry about that.
Rewind 10 or
Working the
15
UI.
seconds.
Well, we'll wrap it up and basically say that what we as a DAO or as Beanstalk Farms or as individuals ultimately want to want to host is probably like the question that should be answered most independently from the tech that is being built. The hosting is probably where the majority of like the risks come in from a legal perspective. The hosting is where it's the least important who is the host, I would argue, from Beanstalk's perspective. And it's probably not, it's probably not priority 1, 2, or 3 for Beanstalk Farms in the short term to roll out a DEX that aggregates well and tractor and has all sorts of functionality, except, and this just to push back on what we're saying, there is something to be said for having a three-pool DEX trading pools replicated on wells, and then pairing those pools with beans ultimately and seeing if the Beanstalk native yield can attract some liquidity away from traditional DEX. So to some extent, there's an open question as to, in that case, does the step of adding liquidity to these non-Beanstalk pools that then get traded against as like the LP tokens get traded against beans and deposited in the silo, if that requires a DEX. So there is functionally an argument to be made that Beanstalk Farms will ultimately decide that it's in their interest to support a DEX because it reduces some friction to getting Beanstalk. The point is that at least at the moment, I think to answer Albion's question on the UI front, we're not building, or at least I don't think we should build a separate DEX interface on day one. But everything that we're building should be built assuming that if we either we will or someone else will, and the goal is
I think we lost you there at the end, Pubs, but I think the point has come through.
Wanted to share maybe some thoughts on the overall discussion. I think the questions and the thinking about having a product are really important, and they are valid, and they may become a priority for us at some point. But before doing any of that, really the questions that we'll want to always ask or keep asking is, what is the problem that we're solving? And once that's sorted, then we can think about the product in a different way. To me, the swap page that is already live is, to an extent, what can even be used once we have all of the tech behind it.
Yeah, I think that certainly the existing page can be adapted, and this was kind of the original plan as it stands, or as it stood. I think that yeah, perhaps it's no. I don't have much more to add here.
I just want to talk briefly. Can you guys hear me now? By the way, sorry.
Yes.
Just want to talk briefly about why this is the right strategy, in our opinion. It's because this is where censorship resistance and decentralization ultimately comes from. If the on-chain stack and the indexing, which can be deployed on a decentralized network somewhere, the indexing software are open source, permissionless, and generalized and really functional, such that the only work to be done is creating great UX that integrates the backend middleware, and the UX or the UI, the code that is implementing it. A lot of it is open source, such that the friction to create and redeploy amazing user experiences is super low friction, that is where censorship resistance comes from. That is where ultimately decentralization comes from. Because currently, the main place where there is, assuming that you have permissionless, open source, decentralized backend and middleware, the main place where there seems to be a chokehold is the front end, and particularly hosting front end. And so what we can do as a DAO is to make it as low friction as possible to host great user experiences. And that is the reason why we are incentive aligned to build in this way, such that in the long run, the adoption of Beans cannot be stopped through the single UI or UX being shut down, because the cost and friction associated with creating comparable user experiences is near zero.
I do feel like Chad's and Albion's points were less about who's hosting it, but about the designing and implementation of it. But still think you make good points.
Absolutely.
But I think this is the point. Like, we should be putting out base implementations of basically everything that we're working on. But whether we decide to host it or not is like, that's the only product question as I see it. Everything else is in scope.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. That seems like a tough pill to swallow here, to go put all of the effort into building a pretty complex product and hope somebody else hosts it. Perhaps maybe, like, I think if that's the direction we're wanting to go, then much more effort should be spent specifically on not necessarily even recruiting for Beanstalk farms, but recruiting for people who want to go work on this themselves and just helping figure out what they need. I'm wary of us making decisions about what a user interface would look like for somebody else's product and thinking that will work. Ultimately, I think the vision of having generalized and composable components is probably directionally right, but particularly from a user interface perspective and from like a development perspective, gets very complex in practice. And I and a number of the other engineers have spent like a long time doing this kind of thing, and I think that I don't think that's going to pan out how perhaps you might think. And so I'd
let's be
suggest
specific. I think to get into the weeds a little bit, and I know we're now running over time, but we can go. I mean, we have at least another couple minutes here on this end. The idea is, for example, the charting software that Sweet Red Beans has been working on, that is an example of a piece of the stack that can help create great user experiences that should be implemented in open source. Now, the way
that's a multi-year. We're talking several years.
This is the whole point, which is that this is in the context of what are the specific products that are getting built in the short term. This is where the alignment needs to come from in terms of what to prioritize, what to actually build in the next couple of months. But the point is, what are we trying to implement ourselves? The goal is to implement technology that can ultimately make it as low friction as possible for others and perhaps ourselves. But the concept is for anyone to create great user experiences to interact with this technology. So don't think it's a couple month project to do any of this. Basically, the indexing tech, as we've been discussing, is also going to take probably years to build properly. So none of this is going to get built overnight. And the idea that therefore we shouldn't continue to think about what it is that we're actually building, to me, is the wrong attitude. Instead, I agree, it is important to put pen to paper and decide, okay, what are the next 3 or 4 products that are going to launch that we need to support, but at least from this perspective, feel like those have already been pretty well defined, right? We've got the Sunrise improvements with the Dutch auction. We've got the Bean-ETH well, which needs to be incorporated into the Bean.money website, independent of a separate DEX. And then there's a variety of like the claim and do everything. So to me, it's like, what are we doing on these calls? We are trying to orient from the biggest macro perspective possible, such that the DAO understands what's being built. The DAO can contribute to the discussion on what Beanstalk Farm should be building or aiming to build, and to have all contributors or potential contributors be able to understand where we're all going together. But I think we really do need to recognize that the next couple of months, the next 2-3 months of work, I think we all, and if people don't understand what they need to be working on in the next 2-3 months, they should raise their hands. But I think that they should. Like the next 2-3 months of work have very clearly already been defined, and therefore the question ultimately is, what are we doing in the grand scheme of things? And perhaps then we can figure out, well, what do the next 9 months to a year look like? What do development priorities over that time span look like? But I mean, to some extent, even
So that well defined, to be frank, and I think like the impetus for this call in the description is like what's left to ship wells and tractor and all that kind of stuff, and that's what drove the related to wells. Exactly what does the front facing product look like on day one when we press deploy on Bean-ETH? And I think that's what bifurcated the discussion a bit. And tractor I think also fits in the bucket of this very long development process if you abstract it all the way out. And the reason I brought up the specific markets question earlier, bringing up the pod market and others, was to try to roll us back a little bit and think about like, okay, if we go put some time into completing the on-chain side of this system and we start to think about what it might look like to have a product that is built using the tech, what does that look like? I think obviously, I agree that when we zoom out many years down the line, it is good to be pointing towards this like fully generalized system. But it seems like we need to like zoom out or maybe zoom in a little bit is the correct term, and think about what the next component of it is. So with respect to tractor, I think that's still up in the air. That we brought up some good examples. With respect to wells, it sounds to me like the real question or perhaps uncertainty that we're hitting at is, to what extent is Beanstalk Farms trying to drive this into what this like full DEX system, which would involve a number of pools, its own UI, its own SDK, some other like set of components that would sort of as a unit be our competitor to Curve or Uniswap or whatever. And if that's not the scope of the work of Beanstalk Farms, then that needs to be pretty clear. And I think that raises some questions about like who's going to do that and how can we best set them up for success. And frankly, probably changes a little bit of the directionality of what the engineering team works on in terms of building user interfaces versus building more like the underlying components or APIs or indexers and all that stuff. So I don't know if that makes sense, but that's kind of I think the where I'm standing on this.
Yeah, and want to emphasize that I think that's why it's important to have an opportunity for some of the teams that are building some stuff in the ecosystem to come up and present to orient our conversation. So perhaps that should be the next call, would be to have maybe the root team talk a little bit about what they're building. There are a couple other teams. I know there's irrigation protocol. There's another protocol that I think Mod is working on that maybe he wants to present. Mod and Thunderbroker are working on. So there's a couple products or projects and products that are hopefully in the next couple months going to be using this tech as well. And from that perspective, yeah, it would probably be helpful to have them contribute to the framing of our next discussion.
Yeah, happy to, and I believe everyone is happy to anytime. I think, again, the discussion goes to what is the problem that we're solving before thinking of what is the product that we want to market or sell. And we haven't discussed that enough, I think.
Which, the problem that we're solving or the product we want to sell?
No, the problem. So I think at some point we were discussing the markets. What do we imagine there? Let's discuss these markets. Let's discuss what friction currently exists in these markets and how can we, add value.
So, no, we're running now over the 2-hour mark. Perhaps the next call, not sure when it's scheduled for, but that should be start with some of the groups that are building on top of Beanstalk to present what they're building and how they intend to use some of the architecture.
Sounds like a plan here. Hopefully can lock in like a recurring time slot so we don't have to schedule each time, but I'll follow up there. All right, why don't we call it there then? Thanks everyone for participating. This is great.
See you guys.
See ya.